Hi, welcome to another episode of Faith 234. Here we're going to share our testimonies, our impressions from the Come Follow Me lesson of this week, which was 2nd Nephi chapters 3, 4, and 5. But before I do that, I want to just point out one quick thing that I noticed or that I was impressed with. If you look at the first 5 chapters of 2nd Nephi, and apply a key word to each. When I did that, I kind of noticed a sequence. For example, in chapter 1, I took the word awake, which Lehi tells Laman and Lemuel to do. Then in chapter 2, it talks about agency. And then in chapter 3, it talks about the restoration and the covenants, but kind of how that covenant's going to be restored eventually. Then in chapter 4, it talks about struggles that Nephi had. And then in chapter 5, talks about how Nephi and his family lived after the manner of happiness. But if you look at that sequence, it goes from awake to just realizing, being aware of things you need to change in your life. Then chapter 2, using your agency to make those right decisions. Then chapter 3, that doing that will restore you as a person. And then chapter 5, there are going to be struggles though, even as diligent as we try to be faithful. And we can expect that even if I had the struggles. But in chapter 5, we can choose to live after the manner of happiness. And that will happen if we continue along those paths of righteousness. So let's just jump into chapter 3. So one thing in chapter 3, and I kind of already alluded to it, that I liked is at the end, Lehi is trying to really, I think, comfort Joseph in why he's stuck in the wilderness and all the things that happened, and showing him that it was part of the covenant that started with Joseph of Egypt. It's coming through him, and then it's going to come again through Joseph Smith. But at the end, I like how Lehi says, it's not so much about the Josephs or about your name, but in 23 it says, it's because of the covenant that you're blessed. And that's why everything that had happened is so important, and why that covenant is important, because it's going to bless him, it's going to bless his posterity, and it blesses us because that covenant's been restored. And then it says that through that covenant, it's going to bring back, this is in verse 24, it's going to bring to pass much restoration unto the house of Israel. So it's not just restoring the gospel or the organization, but it's intended, the covenant is intended to restore us to God, restore us to our spiritual nature that we had in the pre-existence, and prepare us here to be restored to hopefully a celestial life or exaltation. So, any comments?
It just brings to mind, to me, a lot that President Nelson has said, where he keeps saying the restoration is ongoing. People talk about when the gospel was restored. The gospel is being restored, but more important to that, people are being gathered and restored back to the covenant. So when he talks about the gathering is the most important thing that's going on right now, it's all part of the restoration of the gospel, the restoration of people back to the covenant.
Another thing, then moving down to chapter 4, a couple things that caught our attention was in chapter 4, verse 11, it talks about how that Lehi blesses Sam, and that thy seed for thy inheritance, thou shalt be like thy brother. And I think one of the podcasts I listened to pointed out that, later on there's no Samites, there's no group that identified with Sam like they did with, Lamanites or Zoramites or whatever. But that's a good thing, because I think it showed that Sam was all in. He was willing to accept everything that Nephi was telling him, that Nephi was the leader, the prophet, and him and his family were united with Nephi. And they didn't see themselves as a separate family or even clan or whatever, but they became part of the gospel and united in the gospel. And I just think that's a good lesson, that sometimes, even though we may not feel like a leader or somebody that can take the front, those leaders also need people that can support them and are willing to back them up and follow them regardless of what others may think or what others may do. And so I don't know, that just stood out to me, that how noble and righteous Sam must have been, even though we don't hear much about him, and he was willing to kind of turn his life over to being a full Nephite or a full disciple of Christ, like Nephi taught. And then also in chapter 4, in verse 28, no, excuse me, it's 26. Why should my heart weep and my soul linger with sorrow? And that sure sounds like some, mental struggles. And, it could be depression, anxiety, or just whatever. But I loved how Nephi was willing to put that into writing. And of course, Lehi just died, and now he's moving forward. And it's reasonable that he would feel some despair, maybe, or some hopelessness, or just be overwhelmed with the challenges. But I love his approach to dealing with that, and how in verses 28 through 30 he talks about, "Awake, my soul. I can get out of this. I know what to do, where to look to come out of it." But then down in verse 33, "O Lord, wilt thou encircle me in the rows of righteousness? Make a way for mine escape. Make my path straight. Clear the way before me." So he had the faith that that would happen, that he could eventually climb out of this period of darkness. And then in 34, the first sentence says, "O Lord, I have trusted in thee, and I will trust in thee forever." So I think he realized that, this may take a while. It's not going to happen overnight. I'm not going to feel great tomorrow morning necessarily. I might. And there's going to be other struggles down the road. But yet he knew where to put his trust and was willing to do that forever through no matter how long or deep those dark periods are. And even though we may not struggle with mental problems to the same degree as others, I think we all have periods of darkness or maybe doubt or uncertainty that we go through that can apply to what Nephi went through.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you let yourself start on that road, you can kind of pile on yourself. My sins, I'm a wretched person, I sin a lot, all of the things that I'm doing wrong. And it seems like he started out that way, but then in 19, he just kind of stops and says, "Nevertheless, I know in whom I trust," or who I have trusted. He's always been there before me, and he kind of turns it around. So I think there's been times in our lives when, I don't know if we have anxiety about what's going on now, what has happened before, and we allow it to start piling up, and then we start feeling worse and worse. And this is a good example of how we can just stop that process and remember the way the Lord has blessed us in the past. Nevertheless, even though I am a sinner, even though I make mistakes, even though all of these things, I know the Lord will bless me. I know he will guide me and forgive me if I repent. And so that's when his psalm, or whatever we want to call this, takes a turn. And he talks about being blessed and saved through Christ. And so I think when those times come, and we know they're all going to come, we're all going to have days when we just are down on ourselves because of mistakes we've made or whatever it is. We just need to remember this, maybe go back and read these scriptures and realize we know who we can trust. We've trusted him before. He's blessed us before and helped us. So I think this is a really good example of how to kind of turn that thought process around.
And I like also how in verse 28, where he said, "Awake my soul," that's the same thing that Lehi was telling Laman and Lemuel to do back in chapter 1, yet they didn't have the spiritual maturity to do that themselves. But Nephi did. He could just kind of work through it himself and knew that he needed to awake, and apparently he did it. So good for Nephi. Okay, the last one that we really want to focus on that means a lot to us is in chapter 5, where the Nephi and his family and his group is separated from the Laman and Lemuel and their family. But down below, it says in verse 27 that they lived after the manner of happiness, and how important that is for that to be the focus, because there was a lot that they could have focused on that was going on in their life, but they focused living after the manner of happiness. And I looked up manner from the 1828 dictionary, and it says that manner is a habitual practice, a way of performing or executing. And so that habitual practice implies to me that it's not just a one day or one thing routine that we can do and expect happiness, but it's a continual process that we have to work at and to apply to our lives in order to achieve it. And of course, it's not going to happen all the time, but as we do those things, we're going to find more happiness in our life than not. And even if we're going through rough patches, maybe underneath it all, we know that happiness is there. And we're old enough to know that the things that are listed or talked about previous to that Nephi and his family did that brought them the happiness are true. We can testify that if you do those things, they will bring happiness. And if you don't do them, you may think you have happiness, but it's not going to be the eternal happiness or the celestial happiness that we're really striving to achieve.
Well, and I think if you guys all look back to when you were all in the house, you're growing up, we may not have been 100% consistent with family home evening or scripture study in the mornings or whatever, but I remember when we did try and we were doing it, things just seemed to go more smoothly. And so I think that is something that we can go back and look at and remember. And even though your biggest memory might be me standing at the bottom of the stairs yelling, "Time to pray," when we did it, I think it helped things go more smoothly. And so that's just one example of doing your best to try to live after the manner of happiness. And we still had struggles, and I'm sure that they did too. But as long as you have those practices in place, we're more likely to find happiness in life.
Yeah, and it's not just even the spiritual things, because some things they listed were, being industrious, being prepared. So even just some of the temporal things that you need to take care of, I think, are an important part of happiness. But the primary ones, the most important ones, are the spiritual ones, those primary answers, and particularly the temple. I just have a testimony that, if you need a spiritual uplift or things aren't quite going right, that going to the temple, even if you don't have the best experience or you don't get the answers you're seeking or whatever, I always come away those days, the week after, just feeling so much better, more happiness. And I think it's part of just the sacrifice of doing it, but also the part of being there, feeling the Spirit, and then having that with me for the rest of the week or whatever the case may be. So I think that's our testimony, is that doing those spiritual things on a regular basis are what really bring us the happiness. But at times we do have to do the temporal things. Those are important as well.
Well, and if you look at the contrast between the Lamanites and the Nephites, the Nephites, they planted seeds, they increased their herds and their flocks, and they built homes and they built temples, and they had an industrious civilization. And compare that to the Lamanites, where it says they did become an idle people full of mischief and subtlety, and they only sought for beasts of prey in the wilderness for their food. Their thoughts were not on serving each other and let's make our community more united, and they had a whole different mindset. And so I think just the being industrious, thinking of others, building a community is, those are the temporal things where it starts.
All right, so those are our thoughts on those 3 chapters. Thanks for watching. We love you, and remember,
keep the faith
and keep the commandments.
Love you guys.
Bye.
Bye.